It all really began, when was it? 3 years ago when you actually first had the idea? So take us through what you wanted to do with this and why you had this idea.
Well, I don't know among anybody here, but I have this collectomania where suddenly I get obsessed about things and I just buy and buy and buy. And my wife, gets very annoyed with me a lot of the times because she can see all the credit card statements, and she sometimes asks, "What's this?" or "What's that?" And at one point, I got obsessed with a filmmaker called Andy Milligan, who is not something to be obsessed about, but he's quite interesting. And I started buying his negatives, and I met online through eBay, which is a wonderful thing, Andy's biographer called Jimmy McDermott, who had written a book about Andy Milligan amongst Ross Meyer and Neil Young. He's a very good writer. And he was selling Andy's stuff, and I bought everything he had and so forth, and we became friends. And then about a year later, he said, "Listen, I'm selling my poster collection." And Jimmy used to work or had been the co-creator of something called Sleazeword Express, which was the first fanzine that really took exploitation in a more serious way, and it was all reviewed on Times Square by Bill Landis and Jimmy. They co-created this fanzine, which kind of was the groundbreaking of that kind of film, I guess. But Jimmy said he needed some money, and if I could buy his collection. And I bought his collection for $10,000, and 8 weeks later, about boxes and boxes arrives at the house with about 1,000 posters. And my wife goes, "What's that?" And I go, "Nothing." She goes, "Really?" Yeah. And then I open them up, and it's all this paper, just, old paper. And I go, oh my goodness. And actually, I started, unfolding them, and I didn't know none of the titles really. I knew I'm not a walking encyclopedia, so I didn't know a lot of what was there. But there was some pretty crazy campaigns, and Ryan Gosling was in town visiting us, and he got really, freaked out, and he started taking photos of the posters on his iPhone. And that's when I began to think, maybe there is something interesting here, because, if this can guarantee some kind of almost time travel into another era that really doesn't exist anymore. And I then had met with Alan, who I'd known for many years, and I told him about all these boxes of junk at the house, and we started talking about, well, what if we do a book, And I said, well, if it has to be a book, it has to be the most expensive poster book ever produced. And then Alan introduced me to Harvey. And Harvey Fenn is one of those guys who lives in an attic and makes books and doesn't socialize a lot. But I love those kind of characters. I love those one-man army people. And I said to Harvey, what is the most expensive book you can ever produce? What will it cost? And he went on. I said, no, it has to be the most expensive paper, cardboard design. It just has to be the most expensive. So in the end, it cost about $70,000. I said, great, we'll do it. And it was going to be posters from movies that no one has ever heard of. And it was going to be the biggest volume, and it was going to be the most expensive poster book ever produced. And then Alan came in and had to find research in all the various pieces.
That was seriously the nightmare of this entire thing, because even when I went through the collection, I went over to Denmark and went through all the boxes as well. And although I'd seen some of the films, I hadn't seen a good percentage of them.
And you claim to be like a film
expert.
expert.
And like a lot of people in this audience, we all think we're film buffs. And and there was still stuff in there. And some films took me like months and months and months to find out stuff on. You have no idea how difficult this was. Anybody who says, "Oh, you just went to IMDb," no, that wasn't the case at all. And IMDb is so notoriously bad and wrong. And you kept changing stuff as well. It's true. Anybody out there will know.
Easy, Tiger. Easy, Tiger.
But no, and I remember, and we got to a point where Nicolas keep changing these. He's really obsessive about this stuff. Every time he saw another poster, he bought it, and he said, "I'm putting this in now." And I went, "Oh, okay. Well, I thought we'd finished. No, there's another one." And then it was like, "No, here's another one. There's another 3." And before I knew it, there was like it was extending. And some of the films, we've got them actually illustrated behind.
Well, we should just say that out of the 1,000 that I bought, once we had done a selection, I felt that there was still about 20-30% missing to create a whole roundness of a book. And so I started buying on eBay again, and a little bit here and there. And then I met this other collector on eBay who was really weird, who lived in the desert in the U.S., out in Palm Springs. And even though I spoke to him on the phone a few times, he was very nice, but he had inherited this massive collection of posters from the Pussycat Theater, which was a famous X-rated cinema chain in the U.S. And there I was able to find a lot of the last elements. But it was always very important for me that I didn't want to spend any money on buying the posters. So I was lucky to buy a lot of stuff for $20, $30 from him that turned out to be extremely valuable later on. But one of the interesting things that he had was he had actually hand-painted illegal posters from the Pussycat Theater chain. So that meant that back in the heyday of cinemas, there would be films being shown illegally. And the cinemas would make their own posters basically to promote them, but they would be very crudely done. They would be like the sheepies done in handwritten paint by some 16-year-old in a closet somewhere, and then they'll just post it outside the cinema. Or, Repulsion, was suddenly coming up, and some really interesting, and it was so crude. It looked like almost like, a promotion for a punk rock concert. And I was very intrigued by that kind of aesthetics. So I decided to put that in the book, which of course made Alan's life even more ridiculous.
That was actually one of the most interesting things that you did, I thought, because I know Harvey was a bit reticent about it. But I mean, because piracy, you think about it as like video piracy, but actually wasn't. It's been going on for years. And what cinema chains would do is they'd actually bring the films in and sort of give the rental to the distributor, then they'd actually swap them over to other cinemas, so that actually wouldn't have to pay for those ones. So they wouldn't get the necessary advertising stuff, and they would have to make it. And some of them are amazing. A lot of them are misspelt. We've got a couple of examples I'll show you later. A lot of them are misspelt. But some of them are really extraordinary, and I tell all the Hammer fans that there is a Hammer poster in the book that you will never have seen ever, and you are going to have it just for that reason. So, I mean, it is an incredible section, that. When you look at it in the book, it actually makes more sense than I ever thought it would. I was really pleased with that, to be honest with you, when I went through it.
Well, a lot of the idea was also to make this kind of time capsule, because this type of cinema of the 60s and 70s is something that my generation is very inspired by. I mean, my parents growing up being very inspired by the French New Wave, which, is the worst in my opinion. But so for me, seeing a lot of this was very much, well, in a way, that became very much my identity, because these were the kind of films when I was younger that would really make my mother angry. And so, in a way, it was both a kind capsule for myself, but also the whole idea of going back in time and making this very extensive volume of images that basically presented how films used to be promoted, and the kind of films that are not made anymore, and the kind of campaigns you couldn't even do anymore. I mean, some of the titles, some of the taglines, you can't even do online because you would get arrested. And so the idea was that it was like traveling back in time to an era that basically is very romanticized, because most of the people from that period are basically dead. We just lost Wes Craven a few days ago. And, there aren't a lot of people left, so it was also a way to say, how can we capture something that essentially is just slipping away from our fingers?
And one of the reasons why Nicolas wanted...
Now, Alan is old enough to remember these days, of course.
I was just going to mention
I was
that.
not born yet.
He is so. You are so jealous of the fact that I actually lived on 42nd Street for a while. Bill, he went back. Talked about Bill Landis and the Sleazord Express. And one of the first times I went over to New York, I met Bill, and he took me to all the places that I know you would have loved to have gone to, like the cinemas on 42nd Street, like the Deuce, the Doll, the gay ones, the Adonis.
I'm sure you did the gay ones.
But I mean, really, it was incredible. And I mean, it was an era that I loved going through. I mean, it was quite a scary thing to do when you went on 42nd Street. I mean, every city has their own red light district, and in England, you know, it was usually by the docks. I come from Portsmouth, and by the docks there, I mean, there was always one sort of like red light cinema that you'd see the Mondo Canes and those sort of like, you know, the world 10 times overs, you know, the slightly sleazy stuff. So, I mean, he's always been jealous of that.
I have, which is true. I am jealous that you lived through the punk era. I was too young. I didn't get to experience the disco area because I was too young. And I've asked you a lot of questions about your past, about that time, because I am very jealous in a way, because I think that, you know, that when cinema was exciting to go into, at least as I would remember it, not having experienced it.
Why was it just one sheet you wanted? Because we did have that discussion. Do you remember there was one film, The Love Pirate, out of all of them, and it was like one of the long ones. Yeah. And I kept saying, this is going in the book. I said, well, how can it? Because it's not a one sheet. Why did you want one sheets? Why don't you think of like British quads? Are you familiar with all the different sizes of posters there are, like in Italy and everything? They're all called different things, British quads, but in America it is the one sheet. And this is what you wanted the format to be.
Well, the one sheet was just what the book collection mostly consisted of, and it would make like a common language and a common visual design. So the only rule was that it had to be a 1 inch, and I had to own it. And if I couldn't own it, then I wouldn't want to use it. So those were the two things that had to go with.
Yeah. The idea of the book, just so you know, is that Nicolas has gone through his entire collection and actually pieced it together like he would edit one of his films. So when you actually go from the first page, you just leaf it over, and it actually tells its own particular story. That's why there's a lot of juxtaposition between the posters that you'll see if you decide to buy it, which I suggest you do. It'll be out in the lobby, £60, thank you very much. But that's one of the reasons why you wanted to do it. It's got a definite beginning, it's got a definite end, and it sort of has a theme through it, and that's what was really important to you.
Yeah, I mean, I drove Harvey crazy many hours because I kept on changing the order of the images. And I approached very much the editing of the book like I do my movies, where each image had to have a specific emotional impact, but it had to lead into something else. And it must never be predictable, it must never be, you know, it has to be surprising, it has to be a sense of movement, and there has to be no way a kind of language which makes you kind of guess the ending. So there was always a constant movement. So it took about, from starting the project, it took us 3 years to finish it, basically. And that was both to Alan's dedicated of finding information and Harvey's, you know, scanning and photoshopping and doing a lot of incredible work on them, and then me coming in saying yes, no, for about 2 years and driving everyone else insane.
Yeah, we have to point that out too. One of the things you wanted to do was actually present them in the most pristine colour. A lot of these posters were literally torn. They had actually censor marks over them. In some territories in America, they would actually have the poster, but somebody would actually, you know, put on a black band across the nipples or something, because that they wouldn't allow. So we removed all those. They were de-wrinkled, if that's a word, and they were also sort of like really tidied up. There were some that were really quite in a real state. But when you see them, they really pop off the page in such a way that it was unexpected to me. I thought they looked really good. I was really surprised at that. It was also very important to Nicolas that the stuff I wrote 200 words on every film, which actually proved to be really difficult. But it was important to you that they weren't review-led. Instantly, overnight, when he told me that, my whole writing style had to change, because I can be quite nasty when it comes to this stuff. But I mean, as a result of that, it was like, you know, just the facts. It was this. We found out, thanks to Francis Brewster, who did a lot of additional research for me, he found actually, we should say also that in part of the collection, Jimmy also sold you a lot of press books, and I found those absolutely invaluable because, seriously, when you leave, go and Google a film called The X-Rated Supermarket, which is one we have, and you will find absolutely nothing anywhere on it. And yet, Francis, we had to go to the British Library, we went everywhere to find stuff on this. And that's why I like this book again, because it is going to cover a period, it's not like any other poster book or any other exploitation history. It actually covers things that you've really never heard of, and to a great extent, neither had I, until I actually went into it. And I think there's a lot of facts in there. And distrib pics, remember we had to do, there were some distrib pics, they were an early softcore porno production company. There are a lot of those there, and even they didn't have things on their file. And you had to personally ring the head of distrib pics, remember, and say, it's me, can you please open up your vaults and try and find some information on some of these films? And so even Nicolas had to sort of like move in on that. It was actually such hard work, but when I look at it, I really genuinely think we did a good job. So that's just me personally speaking. I'm very proud of this book, actually, not just because I work with Nicolas, but I actually think it actually adds something beyond just the poster image. And I think that's what's good about it.
Well, the idea was that to do the Warhol trick was to take something that was considered complete trash in that era. These movies would maybe play a week and then they would disappear. And basically reintroduce it in such a high-end way that it becomes almost an artistic expression. And that was the reason why everything had to be the most expensive of everything, because it was taking something that was perceived in one way, and then we cut to many years later, you can suddenly reintroduce it in a completely different situation.
No, so really, we did put a few things in there that we just so people would actually have a recognition factor, like snuff is in there because that's a particular favourite of yours, of the posters.
Well, snuff is a very interesting poster, but it's fairly. There are a few things that are famous. There's Queen of Blood was in there, Astonishing She-Monster, Snuff. There are a few ones that are in the auction rounds. If you go online and buy, a lot of them goes for a lot of money. But it was a way to help introduce the world. There's some sense of recognition, and then it opens up to the most obscurities of obscure. And then for me, there was only one poster that we put two examples of, which is Night Tide by Curtis Harrington. And that was a more personal thing for me. I was friendly with Curtis before he passed away some years ago. And I always loved his film, especially Night Tide. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's an absolute marvelous film. And he had a very difficult career, and he had a very disappointing career, and I really wanted one way to kind of acknowledge that, his contribution is much more significant than he gave himself credit for.
We were going to have a lot more Danish movies in the book originally. Do you remember? We were going to do that, and then we decided no, it was a bit too obvious to do that. But it is a history of Nicholas's personal taste. As you said, Curtis Harrington. You did veer a lot towards the Joe Sarno films.
There's a lot of Joe Sarno, there's a lot of Swedish, and then there's a lot of some Danish.
Doris Wishman as well. Are you all familiar with these names? I'm wondering if we're preaching to the converted, or you actually, do you know about all this stuff? I'm just wondering if you do.
Well, Joe Sarno was an American who made, in the 60s, a lot of these melodramatic filmmakers used sex as a way to make films, but making some pretty interesting melodramas before hardcore came and everybody went in that direction. And Doris Wishman, which is by certainly no Orson Welles, did some very interesting, very personal films in her early start of her career. But they were all very extreme, and those were the things I found very interesting. I'm not a big, I like more the melodramas than I like the horror and the sci-fi, so there's more melodramatic and usually sexual frustration-oriented posters.
Yeah, you were very hot on all that sort of stuff. I mean, seriously, anything with a bondage picture, Nick, it would take me ages to sort of like get you not to use it, because it got to one point where all I was writing about was bored housewife, leaves her husband, has a lesbian affair, and then joins a swingers club. Seriously, that was all. It got to the point. There were so many of these films. They were dealing with the same subject matter. It was quite extraordinary how it was. I mean, lesbianism was fine. Homosexuality wasn't.
There's not a lot of gay stuff.
No. Gay at this time was very art house.
Right.
Yeah, lesbianism was sexploitation.
Right.
But
There was one called Eddie, wasn't there? That was a prison film.
Yes. Yeah, we went through that. There were some that we really were really edgy, weren't there, too? Some of the titles we thought, can we possibly put this in here? That would be appealing to the Deep South market. I will say no more than that. But it's a case of, but that's why I like this so much, because it is the whole history. You say it's from the 50s and 60s. There are posters there from the 30s as well, and even the 20s. True, yeah. Because, exploitation was famous. I mean, there are 40 Thieves. David Friedman was one of these people. They're basically carnival barkers who actually just sort of moved over to film, and that was exploitation. What they would do, they would take a film from the 20s, and we have one, and they would keep adding extra things in and then releasing it every 5 years. And one is even a silent film, and they actually even added just some dialogue over the top. And these films had incredible lives for about 50 years. I mean, Mom and Dad, which we don't have in the book, is perhaps the most famous of the exploitation films, because it was divided into females one night, males the next. Because if you were married, you couldn't possibly watch the birth of a baby footage, was actually what it ended up with. Because those were the days where that's all you could ever see. You couldn't see vaginas in anything apart from what would be called, health and education films. So, that's why I like this. I'm a particular fan of this genre, as I think you can probably tell. And that's one of the reasons why Nicolas and I got on so well right from the beginning, because we would share stories about that stuff. Because you have a lot, you have even more of that, because from your Toby Hooper, the whole Texas Chainsaw Massacre thing. Nicolas actually released Texas Chainsaw Massacre in Denmark on the re-release, didn't you? So we share a lot in common when it comes to that. Let's take a look at some of these. Masterpiece. Well, you loved this, didn't you? Because of the
What's there not to love?
This is one of the nicest, I think, graphics in the book. Basically, this is like the sexploitation version of Sunset Boulevard. Even one of the characters is called Norma Demond or something, I think, as a result of that.
Have you seen it?
No.
Oh, right. Okay.
I mean, this is the thing. I think I've seen 25% of the movies.
Okay. I think I've seen 10%.
Yeah. So, but you like this particularly because this is how they would sell them. I mean, this was probably one of the worst films ever, but it's got such a great poster. How can you sort of not go and see it, really? I mean...
Well, that was so strange was that apparently the quality of these films were, according to Alan, supposed to be very bad. But the style of them, especially the design of them, was just so outrageously sometimes beautiful or really poetically crude that it became like an artistic object in itself. It's almost irrelevant what they were made for, but what they are themselves is what makes it interesting.
I mean, going back to Doris Wishman, I mean, why people like her films so much is because they were all shot in her apartment in New York, basically, I found out. Using her boyfriend, her cleaner, and the concierge down the stairs. and when she didn't know what to do, she was trying to tell the story. She'd cut to an ankle, or then she'd sort of cut to the sideboard, and there'd be a 5-minute shot. I'm not joking, like a draw, and then it would move back to a bit of the story, and this is what filled it up. But as long as she provided at one point a naked person in a doorway, that was it, and you actually sat there waiting for this one shot.
Right.
It's an extraordinary way of dealing with it, but people did, and that's what 42nd Street was all about.
How dangerous were those cinemas? Because there was a lot of writing that there was when you read Bill Landis's text about how dangerous it was back then.
Well, the only time I ever felt scared was I actually went with Bill Landis to this gay cinema, and where he was in the film that I was watching.
All right.
And I thought, oh, because he was married and everything. And I thought, oh, okay. And I thought, this is weird. And that was and it was on the Bowery. I always remember that. And we had some homeless. And this is the trouble. There were either prostitutes in the front row, sort of giving people, like hand jobs. There was either like gays cruising the toilets, or there were drug dealers, and there were homeless. So because they were open 24 hours, most of these cinemas. And if the film didn't work, they were off in 2 days. I mean, none of this sort of like 7 days run. If they didn't make money, they were off. And then they were repackaged and brought back again under a different title. So, it was a good scam, I think. And Shelley Wilson, actually, I wonder if I should say this. I will. I found out that film about the Deuce, which I mentioned to you, is Peter Strickland. Peter Strickland is actually, at the moment, trying to get money raised for a film on the inception of Sleazoid Express. And it's all based around the Deuce, because Shelley Wilson, who actually was one of the most famous owners of all the 42nd Street cinemas, I mean, her boyfriend was a drag queen, right? And and she would put
Sure, absolutely.
It's a great story for Peter Strickland to do, I have to say. And
she was like a distributor, right, on Times Square, and I think she was a Greek lesbian woman that had come had escaped from dictatorship and was a cleaning woman, and started buying real estate on Times Square and had built up like a distribution empire of these kind of films. Yeah, sure. As according to your information in the book.
No, sure. So yes, so her drag queen husband was just a complete beard, obviously. So yeah. Anyway, listen, let's move on. Let's move on to that. You can ask for questions after. Lou Camper, I found out, was somebody who was a producer that most people just went to. They said, "Hey Lou," he was a multi-millionaire, and they said, "Hey Lou, we've got this great idea," and they'd tell him what he wanted to hear, because apparently he was into bondage. And they'd say to him, it's about this girl who gets tied up and this sort of stuff, and loads of whipping, and he'd go, "Here's a check," and apparently then he sort of got found out as being this massive fraudster. So, but we feature a number of his films in the book too. Box Office International was David Friedman's company,
right,
who did join up with Herschel Gordon Lewis to do the whole Blood Feast trilogy. And
created the first gore movies.
Yeah, he created the first splatter film, really, wasn't he? So it was good. But we didn't want any of those. And there is a Herschel Gordon Lewis poster.
That's more the obscure ones.
Yeah, like Black Love?
No, well, there's Black Love, which was this porno film. Yeah. And then there was the vampire one.
Yes. Which one's that? We've gone through so many. Very good.
Thank you very much. Herschel
Who was
Gordon
that?
Good.
Was that you, Westy? All right, Mark. Yeah.
Taste of Blood. Yeah.
All right. Now this is one of my absolute favourites.
Can you read the...
What? The open window on a private hothouse. See Fat Mama teach the age old. But would you go and see that film? No, seriously. I mean...
Of course.
I mean, this must have been a chubby chaser's delight. Obscene House. I mean, you can see that in Cinecolor. This is another one of my absolute favourite things that I love, is the fact that they just make it up. It probably was nothing. It probably was in just black and white with a tint, because they'd often say this, and then they'd just put it in red, and that was in colour. So they every trick in the book.
Have you seen this?
No. I'd love to, actually. I mean, look at it.
Yeah.
It's like it covers every single demographic, doesn't it? Yeah. What is that? I mean, really. But this was what we were going through when we went through Nicholas's collection. It was just like one treasure after another, wasn't it? Which is why it got so difficult. And we had to do photocopies of everything. And then we'd be, in fact, there's a photograph in the book of you doing it. And then we'd put them down in his office in Denmark, and then he'd move them around. And we'd go, "Is this one okay? Is that one okay?" And he'd go, no, it's not.
I don't like that one.
And then we'd argue for hours going, "No, it's got to be there, it's got to be there." And of course, him being who he is has got to have the final word, and that's fine. Yes.
Oh, and this was a standard thing. I've been told that during the heydays, I guess you would see these things on Times Square. that in between the films there would be live sex shows in between the movies, where people would come on stage and perform sex in between the movies.
I never saw that, to be
Oh,
honest with
okay.
you. But I'm sure there was.
Well, that's something that Jimmy told me a lot about, was that, and there's an interesting podcast called Rialto, is that what it's called? Rialto Report, which is a really interesting podcast. This, of course, British guy who's into sex, has this show where he interviews a lot of these X-rated people from that period, and it's very interesting to hear some of the stories. But you hear a lot of them performing between movies on stage on Times Square, so they would do live sex acts in front of an audience. But apparently this is something where they would show this movie, and then afterward there would be a graphic demonstration of all the things that went on in the movie.
That we actually, at one point, we were thinking of actually getting filmmakers involved to actually write a page on their memories. Do you remember that? And you axed that quite early on. Because
To me it became too... For me, I was more interested in the artistic rather than cinematic approach.
Yeah.
And I didn't want it to be a book about cinema, because there are so many great books about that. And I felt that that was something that was so well documented by other people that I was more interested in purely the visuals as an artistic expression.
Yeah, I remember. Because there was one story that I actually do use, because I thought it was so great. Nicholas, of course, is very close friends with Bill, Maniac Cop.
Bill Lustig?
Big Lustig, I always forget his name.
Well, just to say, Bill Lustig is quite an interesting character. He started on Times Square, which a lot of people did in the 70s. Him and Abel Ferrara started together making porno movies. And it was the only way for people to go and make films, because either you can go to film school or you can go and make porn films. And a lot of these filmmakers went and did porn films because that was a way to get their hands on 35mm camera and actually telling stories. So a lot of the filmmakers that came from that era have all started in that area. And William Lustig is one of them. And I've always asked him to do a biography about his own life, because his stories of that era is very interesting.
But Bill told us one of the best stories ever, and I've actually included it in the book, because when he was working on 42nd Street, one of the most famous films to come out of that is something called The Molesters. This was a Swissploitation movie. It was made in Switzerland. It was like a bit of a Mondo movie. It was like a case history on, you'd follow a stalker, and you'd follow somebody who liked sniffing girls' panties, or you'd follow somebody who was a pedophile, and that sort of, it was like that. It was all, and it went into like a red sort of like tinge at the end for everything. But anyway, he told me that he knew the person who picked who bought the film, and this guy was so proud of it. He was convinced he was going to make an absolute fortune from this film. And Bill saw him when he was actually putting this huge billboard up on 42nd Street, the Molesters. And he said, this is going to make a fortune, it's going to pack them in. And suddenly this guy walked past, and he looked at the billboard and said, oh wow, they've finally done a sequel to The Mole People, The Molesters. I've used that story because I thought that was so great. But anyway, actually going back to that, that was part of the thrill of going to places like 42nd Street, though,
Right.
because you were really, they used to call it 42nd Street because you'd only last 40 seconds in it. And as a result of that, it was like hookers standing in the alley. Everything. It was just so great.
But as I understand it, it's quite unique to any other places in the world. They didn't have this in England, did they?
No.
In the same way.
No, the West End was a bit rubbish, wasn't it, when it came to that? It was never ever that sleazy or that exciting. The Dirty Raincoat Brigade, that's exactly what it was. We never really had anything, whereas you could mix with anybody. When blaxploitation was big, you'd have to it was just a whole melting pot would go there. You were warned not to go there.
In Times
Yeah,
Square,
by the police. Yeah, you were definitely warned not to go
Well,
there.
I wasn't allowed to go there by my parents. So
How old were you, though, when you were in New York?
I moved to New York in '79 when I was 9. So
You, again, it was...
So when I started going to cinema by myself when I was like 14, it was '84. It was gone by then.
You would never have been allowed in,
No.
I don't think.
Well, of course, I would allow it in. My parents wouldn't allow me.
Right. Yeah. So that fear of love. This is like one of those educational films, basically where often people like Friedman would actually, at the end of it, they'd have fake doctors come out and sell you a sex manual for like another $2, which was full of, what do they used to call it? Vatican roulette, I think they used to call it, because they used to sell you stuff that you could just buy anyway. And there were so many doctors who also, they just put on their white coats and went out and gave this little lecture, you know, on the thing, and they just a way to make more money. Now I think we share the love. This is one of my favourite posters that we have. I mean,
Well, this is my personal favorite. This was the one that I was like, it's almost like if Basquiat had done a movie poster. And one of the things, it cost me $20 to buy, because I did buy this one from this guy in the desert. And then it's considered a lost movie. Apparently it doesn't exist
none of us have
anymore.
seen it.
But a lot of people have written about it. I think it was, the Cramps even did a song about it, or actually
they have a track, but they say the nest of cuckoo bird, not birds. You can just see it is actually that minuscule S is on the end.
But it's, I just, as a design, I just think it's absolutely amazing, and whatever the film it is. And I think there was a guy on eBay selling outtakes from the film that had been found in a motel for like $8,000 that someone bought. But
I mean, according to the plot synopsis, I mean, it's about, you know, in the bayou, she's a bit of a Norman Bates figure. She sort of like stuffs animals and has this sort of very weird sort of, you know, museum. And if people sort of walk in, she just stabs them. But quack love, what is that? I'm sure it has to be something we're missing out on, Nicholas.
But what about primitive art film of the year?
No, but I love that. I think that is really one of my absolute favourites. This is like a very fake spaghetti western. I mean, it was made. This was an American movie. I mean, it's a Canon production. But it's actually before the Golden Globus boys bought it from whoever they were. And this was supposedly the English title of an Italian Western. And they went to very great lengths to actually pretend that it was from another country, you know, even with fake, dubbing. Joe Sarno used to do that a lot, though, because he made a lot of films in Sweden,
yeah.
and and pretend that they were like something else, and it, so it was a whole way, because at that time, I mean, Swedish and Danish.
Well, there was a lot of sex films made in Sweden and Denmark that would be picked up by American distributors, and they would then dub them and then release them in America as American films. Mm-hmm. So that was, that's why all these European films ended up in these kind of circuits. The most famous one being Summer with Monica, the Ingmar Bergman movie, was picked up by David Friedman and made into a sexploitation movie originally. And then it got re-released in his original version later on.
But because I mean, I've asked you this before, I think, and I can't remember what you said, but because Denmark was so relaxed about sex at this particular time anyway, did you actually have a sexploitation industry yourself?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a huge wave of pre-porno where there was all these silly comedies. That was with all the people that would do the other movies, would also do these exploitation films. And then hardcore came in, and then they started doing a lot of hardcore. But then it very quickly died out, I think, because of the American wave just took over. But I have never really seen a Danish hardcore film.
Really? And at that time also, there was like...
Have you?
I'm an innocent, I guess. At that time, they would do, you remember the big film was I'm Curious Yellow?
That was Sweden, yeah.
Yes, Sweden, and I'm Curious Blue. And there's a whole rash, there's a couple in the book, I think, where they actually use blue and yellow on the actual strapline to try and actually fool you into thinking it's that particular, it's got that salaciousness about it. And I'm Curious Tahiti. They would use this all the way through, wouldn't they? So, an actual unretouched scene from the most revealing motion picture of all time. And notice the A is actually, so you really make note of that. And this is probably building to that particular... In fact, is the negligee drawn on? I'm trying to work out if it is.
Sometimes they had to draw censorship on these posters.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hand-drawn things, which are kind of interesting. But have you seen this one?
Nope.
Oh. Well, apparently it's like a wife's swapping movie, which was very popular at the time in the 60s, where they would do all these kind of swinger films. And this is one of the swinger films of that was made.
And this is one of the where, if you look at when I think we had the press book to this, I think we've got it, and it goes to great lengths to say that it's actually an art movie. That although there's nude people in it and it deals with very adult subject, it's an art film, and it goes all the way through the synopsis. This is art. So you actually don't lose sight of the fact that it's that. But I'm sure this is just the scene that is at the end. But this is going to get you in to see it. Is it? Are you going to go and see this? This was one of the most difficult films to find anything on, because we all thought that it was the Sirio Santiago movie from the Philippines.
Well, it all started with that I bought this poster very late in the process. And I said, Alan, I have something new. And he goes, oh, God, please, no. I said, I have something new. And I said to the person, oh, God, it's horrible. I hate it. I said, no, it's going in the book. But I can't find any information. And I said, Alan, it's going into the book. Then you went in to do it.
And then I thought it was a Sirio Santiago movie, but it wasn't. And then we found out exactly what it was. But I think this has got I thought it was going to be something older, because it has this sort of vague Art Deco feel about it. And this is why you liked it.
I loved it. I think it's an incredible piece of pop culture.
Yeah, I mean...
To me, it doesn't even have to be a movie. It's like beyond a movie poster, you know. Like nowadays, movie posters are generally very mundane or boring or very, you know, conventional of just presenting information. You know, and that it's wonderful to see that there's a real movement, because in a way, you know, any kind of artistic object that we desire, that we like, is also a representation of who we are. And we'd like to have that presentation around us. You know, that's why the idea of having music or film or books in our surroundings is a way to express ourselves, both internally but also externally. And you know, if you go to somebody's house and you look through their record collection, you'll know more about them than ever having spoken with them. So art is a very way to it's like a gateway into our inner selves. And it's great to see there's a huge movement now where people, designers and artists, are basically, you know, redesigning their own favorite movies, or movies are certainly going back to a much more artistic discovery of an expression through a poster that's very much a presentation of what the film is. And there's a really lot of stuff going on, especially on the internet, but also things that people are selling online and so forth, like Mondo and also some of the British companies. So it's very interesting to see that there's a whole movement. And then financially, since I had to kind of go and investigate some of these kind of things when I was doing the book, that there's a whole market for movie posters that is very lucrative. I mean, some of these things go for thousands and thousands of dollars. And all the big auction houses around the world have now added movie posters as a steady or common, basically, auction site where people buy and sell movie posters. So if you have any other lying at home in the attics, you know, there's a lot of money raiding around.
Out of Jimmy's collection, what was the poster that cost you the most?
Well, I bought Jimmy's whole collection cost me $10,000. And out of that, I quickly found on eBay ones that went for $2,000 and one that went usually late around $1,000. So it was very quickly, just the investment was already kind of recouped, but that wasn't, that wasn't the point.
Can you remember what the title was? What was really rare?
Something with 4 naked ladies dressed as Indians. I can't remember what it was called.
Oh, that?
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Was it really?
Yeah.
That's actually one of the worst, isn't it?
Duh.
Yeah, but you know, I know the one you mean, the 4 pictures.
Yeah.
And then the red strap.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That was and then of course, next to the cuckoo bird, you know, became very, very pricey. And then there's just a lot of the Doris Wishman that's very obscure. The hand-drawn ones are very obscure as well.
We didn't use any Russ Myers, did we? We thought that was
a bit too obvious. Well, I felt that Russ Myers was just too common. He's just too famous. And anything that had been printed on a T-shirt, we generally avoided.
Yes. Now, this was yet another nightmare research for me. Unbelievable. There actually was a film called Anomaly, and this is The Daughters of. because obviously it was a sequel, so people came in. And this came out at exactly the same time when they did a report in America that was actually given to the government that said, no, sex films don't harm anybody. They're fine. Why are you even bothering censoring movies? And of course, everyone in over there in government just said, you can't put this out. We've got to have something here to stop it. And so as a result of this, there were a lot of these films that tried to sort of skirt that very fine line of saying, yeah, this is what they're trying to stop you seeing, based on no reason whatsoever. And of course, the classics are here, aren't they? Danger pornography, meaning who's that going to put off, really, unless you want to go. And warning obscenity, you want to see this. So, I mean, I did. This is the classic thing, isn't it? You will be scared to death by this movie. You're instantly going to go. I mean, usually the rule of thumb is the more extravagant the claims on the poster, the worse the film is, because they have to try and get you in there to make money. I mean, these films only cost I think they're like $2,000, if that, weren't they? Some of them, Doris Wishman's were so cheap. They were just amazing. They were all stock footage from other movies. That was another classic case, what they would do. The filmmakers would actually use their own films and make up something that was like a history of the blue movie, and yet it was all just, clips from like 2 years, of the stuff. But they were great to see because they would often walk up 42nd Street and you would see all the classic billboards of all the really famous films that you would like. Well, that's it, isn't it? Through the keyhole stuff. Here's a good example. The Star. Some of these were printed on, weren't they? Rather than, we were trying to actually. I know Harvey was trying to.
Well, the minute that it was printed on the poster, we left it alone.
Yeah.
Because that was part of the design then.
Yeah. That would have been one that would have actually tried to sort of.
Have you seen this one?
No.
Right.
It's a straight movie. Why would I go and see that? Platinum Pussycat.
Who's Sandy Roberts? Did you ever find that
out?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did some stuff on there. There were like about 10 actresses who sort of would do everything. I mean, Joe Sarno would actually use people and put different sort of like pseudonyms on them. Like, so the same actress was called 12 different names. So in 1 year, you could actually see the same person in a blonde wig. Marsha Jordan was the queen of this sort of stuff. She's very famous.
But the kind of things like those kind of taglines that she had a gorgeous face, a voluptuous butt, and a cesspool mind. I mean, why don't they do that? I mean, you're a film critic, and you'd go to a lot of. Why don't they put those kind of things on the Avengers?
Because but they're not allowed to, are they? There is now. I think the worst thing that happened to movie posters is when the sort of like Advertising Standards Commission came along. You're not allowed to do anything. Even today they complain. This is why they've all come back to just like the picture of the star, Tom Cruise, and then the title underneath.
Right.
And that's why I know there's a lot of collectors out there, but who's collecting any of these posters from now? Nobody is really. What was the last great poster there was that you actually wanted framed on your wall? Not at all. I mean, what is it? Oh, yes. Yes, of course. Only God Forgives. I totally forgot. Actually, Neon Demon is a great poster, Nick. That's a really good poster. I don't know if you've seen that one, but with the lips. I think it's great. So, Platinum Pussycat, and was it, and is it? Was it platinum? Who knows? Ah, yes. Now, here's a really good one. I love this.
This is like a pre-Taxi Driver, isn't it?
Yeah, this is about this is the policeman who has to pretend to be a taxi driver and dresses in drag to capture the criminal. Now,
that's a British film. That has to be a British film.
But Clover Films, if any of you out there know the work of John Hayes, the horror director who did Grave of the Vampire, Zoltan, Hound of Dracula, I think he did as well. But this was his film company, and he was actually cloning himself off into the sexploitation industry. And I mean, there is no care taken with this poster at all, really, is there? I mean, it's like slapped on.
It says adults only.
I love the earring. But I think this became this, and we got really confused over this one. I remember because it kept being retitled, and the other title of this is Sweet Trash.
Okay.
And we had a Sweet Trash other film, but
Yes.
it wasn't the same one, and it was driving us crazy, really, to get this done. So, yes, blow the man down. I think this is I do a whole section of one particular poster where I actually mention a lot of the names, the double entendre, there were like poker in bed, which is one of them, and, were you expecting anything else other than somebody playing cards, and there's famous British ones, can you keep it up for a week, which is the job that he goes to, and let's get laid, and laid being the name of the criminal thereafter, So it was all very, very, and this is a typical example.
But this is very much like almost like an underground flyer for
yeah,
avant-garde theater in a way.
yeah, I suppose. I mean, this is a classic one, isn't it? Where they just put as many stills, probably from the same scene, to sort of make it look, sex in the grass, al fresco. That was another big thing.
Right.
There were, it all did. You mentioned sex education. There was this one. There was the encounter groups were very big at that time. This was a good way of getting people's clothes off.
But I love the way that it says, what happens when one man and 7 young girls get onto acid? It's like, why does it be young girls, and one man?
Yeah.
But it's very, it's so crude in a way that it's almost obscure poetry because it's just so crazy even to come up with some of these things.
But if you were, seriously, you're not going to go and see this film to see those questions answered, are you? You know
Of course.
full well.
Of
Well,
course.
Nicholas, you are the perfect person to
Yeah.
have been on 42nd Street at that particular time. Now, this is one, I know you liked this particularly because, again, you had that, no, I mean, you did.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting artistic expression.
You were always saying about the frustration that you saw in these stills. This is what you like so much, so...
Well, I like the kind of crudeness, the way that it's put together, that it's in a way very vulgar and very, sleazy, but at the same time, it doesn't hide what it is,
But there's no care taken on these. It's just like 4 stills. We did find one poster that had 4 stills on it, and it wasn't even from the film. They just put it on there in the hope that who cares? They're just in the background. They're just in the back room, and that's what one of the Shelley Wilson stories is, isn't it? You turn up with a film. She takes a look at 5 minutes of it and says, "I'll have this." Put the poster together, and literally within 24 hours, it's actually showing with a poster that might not have any relevance to do with the film at all. Now this is actually another really...
I was on the fence on this one.
Were
Remember?
you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Harvey really loved this one. I was like, really? But I in the end, sometimes I kept things in because it had a good partner on the other side.
Yes.
And there's a great split with this one.
Yeah.
And then in the end, I began to like it. But this one seems, like more like a musical festival flyer than
Right.
a film poster.
Well, the gag here is when they call it Auntie's Secret Society, but on the actual credits it's ass. You see, and so because it is, I would love to describe it as like an Austin Powers softcore. That is actually really overdoing it, but it is a spy saga in the Bond tradition. Dr. F is Dr. Phallus, and Auntie's Secret Society are going after Dr. Phallus who's trying to take over the world with a sex machine. And in the press book, they actually say, yes, this is going to be such a hit that we've actually got the sequel planned. But as far as I know, they never did it. So, oh yes, there it is. There's the sex machine at the top there. The X-ray. Yeah. So that I actually like that because I think it's really funny. Mm-hmm. But a Preferred Enterprises Inc. production.
Yeah. This is very artistic.
Look at the flower petals.
This was Distripix. This came from this company called Distripix in New York, which was the most successful, or one of the most successful producers and distributors of softcore going into hardcore films. Mm. And it's still around. It's now being taken over by the son of the original creator, and it's trying to revive itself. But this is where, this was an X-rated film, but it has a very artistic expression. It's not as crude as some of the other ones, or as sexually, perverse.
The open-air bedroom in this case is the forest next to the house, where the girls pick up guys and have wild sex. They just that's it. It's just al fresco. That's all it means. And the Distribix guy actually said that he changed American social mores one pubic hair at a time. That's his big quote. I had to use that in the book because I thought it was really funny.
I think it's not so much the films itself. It's just I grew up in New York with my mother and stepfather, and my mother had photographed Jimi Hendrix and Miles Davis, and had been like a high-end hippie. So I didn't have a lot of ways to rebel. But one thing my mother really detested, because we were Scandinavians in New York, was capitalism, Ronald Reagan, and violent films. And those three things became my favorite things in the whole entire world for a very long time. And and of course, anything with violence sometimes led to a lot of exploitation films of that nature. But I mean, I've said many times, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is what made me want to make films. I don't really consider that an exploitation movie, but it is in that category. I just considered it, a very extreme art film. Well, actually, the Neon Demon, there's only been a teaser poster that is out. It was done by a really good British company, but that combination of some of the books was very helpful in designing that. But actually, because I had this book with me when I was writing the Neon Demon and producing the Neon Demon LA, I used the book as a lot of reference. If I was stuck on ideas, if I couldn't come up with anything, I would go through the book, because I was still shifting the arrangement of the posters. So I still had all these copies of the book lying around that I would use to go through. And when I needed some kind of inspiration, I found, whatever, kiss me, kill me, torture me, or something like that. I was like, oh, great, now I know what should happen next. So. Well, it's true. I certainly have made a lot of films about violent men, but I always look at them as being very feminine movies. And, because the act of creativity is a very feminine medium. So, I love women, and I don't really like guys, and I don't really hang out with guys, and I don't really have a guy thing. I love dolls, I love pink, I love girls, I love women, I love everything female. And so it was a great relief for me, and I guess wanting to make films about women as protagonists just was a natural evolution. But you're true that in this area of the book, it was all about the female sexuality and how much skin could you show and how many rape scenes could you show, basically. Sex and violence was really the most common theme in all these movies, whether they were fake documentaries or melodramas or horror films, whatever. Sex and violence was what it all came down to. I did something called the Pusher Trilogy, and in part 2, I thought it could be really fun to do a sex scene, but because you see a lot of movies where people take a lot of drugs and they have great sex, but in reality it's the opposite. So I had this idea to do a scene with Mads Mikkelsen that he can't get an erection, and he's sitting with 2 girls, and it just becomes more embarrassing. So that was the closest thing to nudity and any kind of sex. I think that nudity is not always the most interesting thing. I think that especially eroticism is the line between skin and clothes I find more sexy than one or the other. And I think that sex is more.
I thought we deserved a better backdrop.
Yeah, I just find it more interesting. It's like, I don't really know. It's a very good question. I guess I have to speak to my wife about it. I hired an American designer called Jay Shaw, who's done a lot of work for Mondo. And I just said, look, this is the concept. And I think Harvey, we sent him some of the approaches, some of the images from the book. And he just basically very quickly came up with the half the eyes. And then that was, it was all his design. And it was just magnificent. Mm. So very quickly put a stamp on the quality of the book. You know, I said, it's like, imagine a coffee table book, but just bigger, you know, and louder.